Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to yet another episode of Voice of Youth. I'm your host Ali Mohsin Hashmi. Welcome you to this lovely show where we've actually designed the show particularly for our youth. In Birmingham studio of Hidayat television, we have a dedicated team of specialists and working volunteers who actually put together this show. Yesterday was the first episode of Voice of Youth, where we talked about importance of education on the grassroots. We highlighted the issues, and just a recap of that is that we had senior analysts and panelists who were actually joining us in the studios. Kindly they decided to join us today again. Without further ado, I'll introduce you to the panel. On my left hand side, Sister Amina Bukhari, who is a senior academic analyst and also working on a strategic project, Acorn Primary School. Next to Amina, we have Sister Kuratulain Zaidi. She is Youth Community Development Manager, currently working within the age groups of 13 to 25, working for various councils and also private and public sector. Both of you, welcome to the show once again, and giving us the opportunity to capitalize on the knowledge that you have and also recognize the service and value that you add into the community. First of all, yourself, Amina, we spoke about yesterday, yesterday we talked about various issues associated with education on the grassroots level, and we understood that the reason why there are a lot of problems in the youth are purely because our youth is one of the deprived sector, or I should say entity of our community. And at the moment, how youth feel that the reason why there is a very high crime rate, very high unemployment rate, and they struggling to integrate with the society, in particular after 9/11 and 7/7 incidents. And even though they do condemn the same incidents, just how our brothers and sisters in other ethnic faith would, but yet they're not integrated in the society. And also where there are other members of society who are not from ethnic background, but they are adding value, senior positions in public and private sector, in manufacturing and computing sector, whereas we struggle to see our brothers and sisters from Asian community to be in those positions. I'll give you an example. I work for a blue chip company and I haven't seen any Asian in my profession for the last 7 years at least. Going back to our yesterday's conversation, one aspect of the conversation was that our parents and our children, which were yesterday's children and today's youth, they equally play an important part. Responsibility sits with the parent for the grooming and upbringing of the child. How do you think our parents played their role since they moved from Pakistan, India, or Bangladesh into the Western world?
When our parents came here, they came as a workforce, and they came here to work in steel, in industry, in manufacturing, in the textiles, and then they didn't have many choices. They came to earn a living, to better their financial situation. But now we've got choices. Now we can decide whether we wish to work in manufacturing or whether we wish to go for further education. And that's how it's different, because we're in a very lucky situation whereby we can seek education, and we can also help our children to seek a better education. And as you said that you work for a blue chip company, and there aren't that many Asian representations of the work that you do. However, there are people, I know lots of people who have done very well, and they've used the platform to achieve a better education, and there are doctors and engineers and teachers and people who are working in senior managers, and big blue chip companies are trusting them to go out abroad and represent them as senior managers. So some of them are doing well, but we need more.
So what's the percentage, ratio and probability of those representing those organizations? Because I'll give you a clear example. The company that I work for, we see a workforce of, I should say, on the strategic floor, which is where the admin senior management block is. We've got, let's say, 40 to 50 strategic decision makers, which includes one and possibly two more. and 47 of those fellow workers are actually from indigenous background. I don't want to turn this debate into a race-based, but I want to stick to the facts. This is you may well disagree with me and say that you know a lot of people who are actually sitting in very good positions.
I was going to.
And I know you do, because you know me outside Hidayat as well.
Yes.
So fair enough, you do, but possibly that's the kind of friendship, and that's the kind of cycle that you have. But what about people who we're talking about masses? So
Yes.
we discussed some rates yesterday. School dropouts 44%. University graduates dropped by 11%, and the unemployment rate amongst youth went up by 18%, and that's ethnic minority. Benefit seekers within Asian community gone up by 21%. Now these stats spoke otherwise. So how do you think when we talk about our youth, we can't be symmetric about it, we can't be very particular about or micro about it. We have to be macro, and on a macro level, we don't see our youth doing well on a bigger scale.
Yes, as adults ourselves, we've got to guide our youth in making the right decisions.
Okay.
So if they're not all highly academic, then we need to encourage them to take apprenticeships or to take on skills-based learning, or to get involved in, even if they are going to get jobs, to help them to get jobs.
Right.
But sometimes, again, I keep going back to education. In some of the inner city schools, some of the children, the language levels are not to a level where the employer would be happy to employ them to represent their company. So the youth themselves have got to work hard to better themselves educationally and not accept second best. They've got to attain the levels and to better their language skills, to involve themselves more in the community, to seek help from their parents, from the job centres, and set their goals high to achieve the best.
Who would give them that level of mentoring? I'd ask you, because you run these projects, and when we talk about government deciding to reduce the public funding by at least 650 million in the next 4 years, which would leave ultimately more than 500,000 members of youth unemployed, where do you see this going?
It's downhill if nothing's been done. I think, yes, we can talk to education, but there used to be a lot of agencies who were support outside of family, outside of the mainstream education. But since the government funding has been a big cut, as you mentioned, it's all closing down. So I think the youth have nowhere to go. Where 2 years ago, there were different agencies in every area, for families, for young people, for education, for employment, for any form of training. So I think a lot of time, I think the community's got to step up now and work together as a community. I believe there's no unity without the word community, so I think now it's time for us to get stronger and provide the things that we haven't got at the moment due to funding, provide those elements.
How does that come together, and the concept of community as in unity comes together? How do you mean? I mean, it sounds very cliche.
Well, it's only a cliche if you don't apply it. I apply it on a day-to-day basis, and it does work. I think at the moment our main concern is that no through fault of the youth, our communities are very segregated now. You've got the Asian community, you've got the Afro-Caribbean, you've got the Somalian community. Now, doing that, you're only going to work for your own people, and that can be also a hindrance as well as a positive as well.
Do you know anybody out there who's working for the community? Amina, you?
Yes, I know, as I mentioned yesterday, that there are community workers. Communities have actually set up their own forums, and they're addressing the issues of underachievement in education and unemployment.
Right.
And these are ordinary people who are gathering once every 4 weeks and looking and talking with the schools, with government agencies and local businesses in getting their youth into employment and to be better citizens.
Okay, so ultimately, we have this particular scenario whereby we're saying, okay, well, now the book sits with the youth, back to youth, because what our establishment is saying that there isn't any money. Sorry, we're not going to spend money. What our community leaders are saying, take the responsibility and hold the flag. And then youth feel that in a very articulated way, we have been asked to leave us alone, kind of thing. So youth again are literally on their own, and they have to do whatever they have to do within themselves, and the level of mentoring that's available to them, it's limited. The resources available to them are limited, and hence the reason why very high crime rates. Unemployment, this is not something youth can create themselves. There needs to be an opportunity. So if there is an unemployment, why is there an unemployment, and who's going to address that? Youth purely can't, because youth aren't going to be the entrepreneurs themselves and then employers themselves and then be employed, unless they actually take the step, which some of our parents did, entered into business, but the trade relationships are not addressed, and so the opportunity isn't there at all.
There is if you apply it. There are some young people who will work in a warehouse via agencies just so they can earn some money. Right. And some young people who got the vision that the only job they want is a suit and tie job. So they've got different expectations. So a young person who might be graduate in English literature or any sort of specific field can't get a job.
I'll take your example. You're an English literature graduate yourself.
Yep.
I know from experience. And where you sit in the community is very high rated and very well positioned. You adding value back to the community, and not many of Qurratu Lane that I know who are doing this.
Well, then you got to question why, because to the outside, they don't see my job as being respected in the community because it's not earning a lot of money, or it's not your average lawyer or doctor in the profession. Whereas I find it, what I'm doing is more worthy and more beneficial to the wider community.
Okay, so again, that would be referring, because obviously I still take you as member of the youth. So if we talk about youth in a particular perspective, whereby we're saying, right, okay, if you want to do better in life, you have to do it yourself.
You got to do yourself, but I think young people now have the mentality, again, I mentioned yesterday, that I want it now attitude.
Right.
They're becoming a lazy attitude, and with the advanced technology, they don't want it. They want it served to them on a plate rather than them having to work hard for it.
Whose fault is that?
You can't really blame anyone particular. Like, I don't want to start blaming, finger pointing at family or the community, or even the social, economic where they live.
There's ought to be blame needs to lie somewhere.
They all have to work in hand in hand as a team.
Somebody needs to take responsibility. Amina,
I don't think we need to. Yeah, we don't need to blame anyone.
Okay.
It's everyone's responsibility, and the youth need to empower themselves to be able to help themselves. But we can't expect it to happen overnight. You can't instill bad habits into the youth and say, okay, right, you're on your own, go and get a job or do. It has to start very young, at a nursery
There are three
age.
divisions of youth which I understand. One, in education, so they are either in universities or in colleges doing A-levels or B-Techs or some various forms of higher education kind of diplomas. Second is who've missed the boat. They haven't been to university colleges and they now moved on. And third is who have been to universities and they've ended up in further two divisions, either failure or very successful. Now, the problem is not with one particular group, and that one particular group is people who've been to universities, colleges, they're now successful, they are now on their own, so they're carrying on with their future. Rest of the diaphragm is where the problem is. So are we saying that people who sit in the far right corner need to come back to the far left corner and start adding value? Is this what you mean by your responsibility sits with youth?
The people who are doing well, such as the doctors and the engineers and so on, they also need to put something back into the community to do some public service duty. And they will, in the least, they will serve as good role models to the community, and they can show that it can be done, that it is achievable. Because sometimes the youth think that it's I can never do that. It's not within my reach. But if those the role models can show that it can be done, that's one step. The second step is for to keep on knocking doors and to keep on asking for help. There's no shame in asking for help.
So can you give me an example of somebody who's, maybe a brother or sister watching this, and they are now, mashallah, alhamdulillah, doctors, and they're engineers, and they're IT professionals, they, contract specialists, accountants, whoever they are now in the practical world. How do you think they can add value? And that is a genuine question. Maybe I want to do that for my community.
Sure.
How do you think we can
with our school project, we've got people who are
Acorn Primary School, for example.
We on our board of members, we've got people who are in auditing, who are in doing youth work, who are
absolutely
lawyers, and they are lending us their service to help us to set up the school.
Right, free of charge, I assume.
Yes,
okay.
Free of charge, and also getting us connected with the right people and putting the proposal together in accessing funding. So that's one possibility that
right, so people who are in the right places, they looking back and thinking, where can we add value? So if you're an accountant, you can look back and look at the project that's serving the community and add value by offering your free services.
Yes.
That could be khums of their time, zakat of their time, that they can add value back in the community. I thoroughly understand that. And now that takes us back to our issue, which we briefly touched upon yesterday, that our youth, along with many other issues, i.e. crime rate and unemployment and lack of opportunity and our intra-UK issues, there is another issue that goes hand in hand, and that is their matrimonial life, because obviously as being Asians, it is an essential part of our life that we have to eventually tie ourselves into a matrimonial affair, and that sometimes is led by the parents, sometimes led by the children, and sometimes by a mutual amalgamation. So that is where my question is: forced marriages, arranged marriages as a result of parental pressure, that is affecting the community to a point where now establishments has gotten involved, government has gotten involved.
But there is, when there's a difference between forced and arranged. That's the difference. People don't understand that if you marry someone, if someone's getting married from the parents, you don't know whether it's arranged or forced. A forced I see, because I work with a lot of young girls who have been forced to marriage and help them to come back to Britain, so that to me is forced. That's going against what we believe as Muslims, which to be the illegal way of getting married.
The way I look at it, in the corporate world, when there is a dismissal of an employee, that's dismissal, and when there is a constructive dismissal, yet leads to a dismissal.
I think we're ignorant.
So ultimately, arranged by peer pressure means you have to look up to your parents and live up to their expectations and the honor, and then accept marriage. Yet the parent would be very forceful, and they'd say, right, okay, this is it, you're marrying this person, you don't need to worry about it. So I think it's down to the parents how they play that really diplomatic part. If they are diplomatic, then it's arranged, and if they're not, then it's forced. Is that not the general view of the masses?
I think it's the concern by parents is that in case their child goes outside of their religion and marries somebody that doesn't belong to their religion, and then it affects the next generation. And that's where some parents, when you're referring to a constructive dismissal, is when they use those emotional blackmail, as some children would define it as, to say, well, you're emotionally now blackmailing me into thinking about getting married
because of your honor,
because of how I wish to conduct my future generation. And you see, I don't believe in forced marriage, but I think that it is good that there are not arranged or introduced, but there's a different way, because if you're going to emotionally blackmail our children, say, look, you have to, because this is what I want and so on. That's probably not the right way to go about it. But if you create an environment where that child is going to automatically choose that person to get married, then there's no harm in that. It's just the way things are
done.
done.
From what you said, to create the environment where the child automatically ends up liking the person, or let's say approve the person to be their spouse. Now, if that environment can't be created because for the other half to be possibly residing in a different country altogether, how would you create that environment then?
Yeah.
And from what you said, that means overseas marriages can't happen.
Yes. As a mother, I would want the happiness for my child, my son or my daughter. So I would first of all find out from my child whether they'll be happy with a person from abroad. Personally, I think there are too many cultural differences for them to get along together, and it's going to create more problems. I think that there are lots of possible suitable matches here which they could pursue.
Is that a soft dismissal of overseas marriage now?
Well, I personally wouldn't encourage an overseas marriage in my child unless he chose to. If he said, look, I would like to marry somebody from abroad, from Pakistan or wherever, then I would consider it. But I wouldn't consider it. It wouldn't be myself who would make the first suggestion.
Okay, so what you're saying is that because yourself being a very practical parent, you'd give that right to your child,
Definitely.
and then you would monitor that right from what I sense. Okay, what about yourself? How do you take this overseas marriage and marriage from abroad as a result of parents' pressure or possibly, honour?
I can understand why parents do it. It's to retain their identity that young British, second generation British born Asian people are losing. They're losing who they are, they're losing their identity. So I can understand why parents feel the need to bring their son's wife or their daughter's husband from abroad to retain that culture, to retain who they are, for the second generation. But then saying that, there's still some families here who have that culture, who are quite very cultured and very religious. So it's depending on the person who's getting married and also the family values as well. And I think that's created, the family environment is created as soon as the child is born.
Yeah.
So
that has an impact
from what you're saying is that it is now going back to how you have brought up your child.
Oh, definitely, and that goes back to the education. The first time you make a decision for your child is through education. And if that's not stable, then everything else is going to be a stumbling block, like your future career or your future wife or husband.
So what you're saying is that as soon as the child's born, it's actually maybe a suggestion for the parents, as soon as the child's born, you actually bring them up in the way that they ultimately accept your decision of an imported wife or husband.
You just need to, I'm not preaching out to the parents because it's not right to do that, but I think you need to create the environment of trust and respect from parent to child and child to parent. And if you've got that trust that your child can come to you regarding anything, and the parents come to approach their child about a future possibility marrying someone from abroad, then yes, they don't have to, if they agree or not, that's up to them. But you need to build that trust environment.
I would throw some stats into this. The marriages dissolved in the first 12 months are 4% increase from 2009 to 2010, and then 2010 to 2011 there is an increase of 9%. That really is a high ratio of dissolution of a marriage in the first 12 months.
I would need to look further into those stats to see whether are they marriages between people who are living here to people in Pakistan, and
no,
why
just marriages within Asian community.
Yes, you see, marriages are failing amongst the Asian communities as a whole. It needn't be marriages from people from Pakistan to people from here.
Okay, so these marriages are not necessarily
linked
overseas marriage,
indeed,
but they could be
yes.
marriages. So what do you think could be the reason why the marriages are dissolved in the first 12 months?
There could be it could be a number of reasons, that lack of understanding or communication, or they might have rushed into the marriage, or you can't without knowing the actual people involved, you cannot say.
So the
it's
micro study would help us
Yes.
understand what leads to the dissolution of a marriage rather than the
Yes.
macro
Yes,
figures.
yes.
Because I'm sure if you think about the recent legislations and laws being designed and introduced in the House of Parliament as well as strict regulations being introduced around marriages, age limits and whatnot, and then you ask yourself a question. These laws are purely being designed not for the society. They're actually designed and introduced purely to tackle a problem that stays within our community. Is this problem as big as that government is now getting involved? And there are a lot of documentaries, our fellow television stations, they actually play those documentaries, and you got to ask yourself a question. Our community now is getting a tag which has got forced marriage written over it. How can we get out of this? And also, who's caused that tag to be stick on us?
I think people who come into this country, regardless of the mum or the father who come in, I think they need to first understand the wider society. And because at the moment, if you come from Pakistan, India or Bangladesh, you stay in your Asian community, then you treat it as like your second home from home, but you don't see the wider issues that their children face, like the integration of mixing with other their peers from different cultures. That's a big factor as well, in a good way. But I think they're so naive or ignorant to the wider society, which impacts, and also the lack of education they have and knowledge about the wider the British culture. I think that restricts them from understanding, which results them from forced marriages. And I think the lack of education in the parents of the wider society.
Does that lead to identity crisis to a degree?
I think it's also fear.
The fear of letting go.
Fear of letting go, and it's also fear that if I don't marry my child off to somebody in Pakistan, they'll go and choose somebody else out of the faith, and or go off and leave or lose their
So
identity.
basically a non-Muslim.
A non-Muslim.
Right,
yes,
okay.
It could be that, or even out of the caste or out of the Shia faith or any faith.
Okay, so from what you're saying is, this is basically a problem. Forced marriage tag comes from the fact that parents, under the fear that their daughter or son may involve themselves into a relationship with somebody who is not from the same faith or same community or same ethnicity. Yet we see the same problem with our non-Muslim ethnic brothers and sisters as well. I mean, Hindu community and Sikh community, they face a similar problem, and I'm sure you're working with them as we speak. So currently, if that problem was only Muslim problem, then it wouldn't exist in non-Muslim.
But also the Sikh and the Hindu community also hold their faith dear to their heart.
And their culture.
And their culture. So I'm sure they wouldn't wish their children to marry out of their faith.
Non-Hindu,
Non-Hindu or
right.
non-Sikh. It's the same with every faith in the other Asian communities.
How does identity crisis come into this? Because some children who are actually living in Western, I mean, obviously all of us are living in the Western society, and some live in pretty indigenous areas, and some they thought to be affluent areas, and some would live in less privileged areas, and they would form part of a lot of ethnicity and a lot of ethnic groups, and Asians in particular, Bangladesh and Pakistanis. So how do you think integration for somebody living in those areas and somebody living in non-ethnic areas, how do the difference between those two individuals, do you think they integrate better who live in indigenous areas, and people who don't live in indigenous areas, they don't integrate well? Because that leads
what
to...
What do you mean by integration? Integrate?
Somebody who's actually born, I'm going to give some examples, somebody who's born in a society, or somebody who lives in a society where you don't see many Asians, to be straightforward, and you go to schools where you see, all you see is, you see indigenous groups, and you see, white students, white families, and they actually make friends with them, and then now they have integrated in that society. Now they would have their challenges, which would lead ultimately to identity crisis, because they would be integrated that far into the culture that they would feel that they are now, or they got to live exactly the same way as they do, unless there's a strong family background
yes.
to it, and upbringing, and there's clear separations, which hardly, I generalize, I dare generalize, on this particular issue, but majority, I haven't got any stats to prove, but from experience, we see challenges around those areas. But similarly, people who live in the areas where there are a lot of Asians, they struggle to integrate with or make friends with, non-Asians or whites, for example. And that how do we get that balance? Does that, because on the right hand side you're seeing identity crisis, on the left hand side there is too much identity recognition that they are not ready to integrate into society to the point when they actually represent UK or Britain, Great Britain in the Olympics or some big event, they would still hold their flag, which is from the origin of their parents.
Sure.
This is exactly what I'm referring to. So these two groups, one is heavily integrated in the society that they near enough lost their identity. One holding on to their identity and not moving on with the society, and kind of creating a drift between the two. How do we get the balance right?
I think that stems from, again, we keep emphasising the family, but family is so strong, it's so important to our culture and our community. I think you need a strong family and a strong individual to have the right balance of East and West cultures. Right. Now I did, when my programme, fun enough, I recently did a questionnaire, different young people, different Asian people, one more influent area and one in deprived multicultural area, for the ethnics who, when the ethnicity tick box. Funny enough, the Asian young people in the deprived area who are very multicultural said they would class themselves Pakistani first, then British second. Oh, right. Whereas the young Asian people from the affluent areas who were predominantly living in the predominantly white areas, class themselves,
richer area. Okay.
Regardless of being rich or poor, they said they would saw themselves as British first, then Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Indian. It's who they influence. They're not a far extremist. They're not in denial of who they are. I think you need the right balance. I went to a Catholic school when I was growing up. Now, when I was growing up, I was the only one with my older brother. And that helped us to realise that, and that moulded us to appreciate other people's cultures and religions, but not forget ours, because my parents sent us to madrasa, went to the mosque and did every community event we attended. So I think the parents need to understand they need the right balance.
Right, so would you say you were an exception?
No, there's many people like me, my peers are similar like me, and they've, I think there's many people out there, but they don't shout.
So when you tick the box, do you tick British first and then Pakistan?
I tick British first, then Pakistan, because why not? This is my country, I was born here. I have every right, as my peers who are not Asian. And once we below ourselves to that they're better than us, that's where the problem stems. That's where we create our own barriers, and that's where our hurdles for our young people get higher.
Why do you think, the left-hand side group, which I mentioned in my example, and then we made a direct comparison, because I would see you sitting in the right-hand corner, and the left-hand corner where, they would still be holding on to their identity and take Pakistani first, Indian first, or Bangladeshi
before
first,
British,
and then go to British column, if they do.
Yeah.
And even when representing Great Britain, they would hold their, ethnic, regional flags where they. It's good
to make sure that you know who you are and where you come from. I think that's quite an important part of the young people, to know who they are. But I think being in fluent area, you're not going to see all you're going to see is people from your own race and your ethnicity. And the question is, why are they all there together? Now, the power to be, the government always pick and choose people where they live in social housing. So if you've got 4 Asian families, you're not going to put them in a predominantly white area or affluent area, are you? You just.
But my question is, and hopefully, you could add value as well. What I'm trying to get at is, why is it that somebody who's living in a ethnic area and somebody who's not living in an ethnic area, they have 2 different views of their identity? Why? Why that divide?
It's because of the influences they get in the community that they live in. That's how they've got their different identities.
Can we drill into it?
Yes, of course. If obviously if they're going to be living in an area where there's a large minority group living and from Pakistani background, and most of the shopkeepers are Pakistani, the schools are full of Pakistani children, and the mosques, and it's mainly Pakistani foods being served, then of course they're going to class themselves as Pakistani. And then they will have difficulty in going.
But they're still studying the English curriculum.
They study the English curriculum, but they live a Pakistani life.
Okay.
Yeah, and the English curriculum does not say that you're not a Pakistani.
Does that mean there's somebody who's living in the affluent areas? They don't.
In the suburbs where the other minority groups live, they are exposed to the more indigenous people and people from other backgrounds.
Yeah, they haven't got the issue of identity crisis. We do.
Yeah, they haven't. They have. I wouldn't say, but they've also got an identity crisis. They've got it, and they've got it. What you picked out earlier, you've said that it's difficult for those who live in large Pakistani areas to go out there and make their name in the world, because the language they speak, their accent, the way they behave, their social etiquette, it does not enable them to break through that social deprivation barrier to climb up the social ladder, because of how they are and the way they live.
How they've been moulded, because you can't
ask. They've been moulded that way.
So does that mean that they are now, they are not being treated fairly because of how they sound, because of how they come across in their dialect?
Education.
Education.
So what we're saying is that we don't see many names coming out of those vicinities in the corporate world or in the practical world and in the senior management world, purely because lack of education in those vicinities higher than these areas.
Sure. Yeah. The parents who came in the 60s and the 70s, their children, those who've had their children do well have gone on to get very good jobs, and they've moved out of the area. And some of them moved back, but most of them have moved out of the area, and they've done well.
Okay.
The ones who are there are the ones who have suffered with education, have gone into businesses, and are struggling, but still we are getting some coming through who are doing well, but we need more. Now, going back to the ones who are living in the affluent areas, they also have an identity crisis, because they don't know whether they are Pakistani or whether they are British, and what foods they should be eating and how they should conduct themselves. And that in itself is a problem, and that's where parents have got to work harder in talking about their identity.
Do you think it is important, going back to your comment that they take Pakistani first and then take British afterwards, do you think it is important for us to even analyse what do they take first?
Well, it won't just mean if you apply for a job now, you have it, equal opportunity forms, you go to...
But it's optional?
It's optional, but it's optional. But you just fill it in, subconsciously fill it in. Any forms you go into, like if you're registering for the gym or a sports centre or anything, or ethnicity comes first.
Sure.
So,
but the thing is, we're not Pakistani first, we are British.
That's right.
Somebody who's born here, and they have lived here for more than 2 generations.
And this is their country, and this is a country that is caring for them, offering them an education, offering them opportunities, and they have a right to serve their country, and they have a right to be called British. And yes, they are Pakistani heritage, and yes, they should retain their culture, but they are British Pakistanis.
How come they're not called English? If somebody's born in England and lived in England, I go one extent further, served the England. They're not allowed, and I choose my words carefully, they're not allowed to call themselves English if both their parents are not English.
Well, English that's not a choice on the tick box. That's one, and secondly, it's the British Isles.
Yeah.
So it's Great Britain is made up of Wales and Scotland and England and Ireland. So that's why we're assuming we are British, because we're part of a collective Great Britain, not England. England is just part of Great Britain, and it's not a choice that's given. Are we not allowed to be? Is that your question? Are we not allowed to be English, or
we're not allowed to be English? Why are we not allowed to be English when we? And this is a wider term that we use when we refer to a member of Caucasian or indigenous group. So
I think it also has acceptance as well. As an individual, will you be accepted in your community or in your down the street if you went around saying you're white or you're English?
Exactly. So when you say English, in subconscious you're thinking somebody who's white.
Yeah, you're in denial of who you are. You're denying your heritage that you have, whether it be both parents born from Pakistan or you're second generation British. Why should we deny who we are for terminology or for, we can still get to where we want to get to. We have to work hard, twice as hard as our white English people to achieve, but
I don't think there's anything wrong with not being English. I'm quite proud of the fact that I'm not English, because I'm not English. Because
that's a fact.
It's a fact. I'm not English, and the person who is English is English. That's their identity. This is my identity.
So what makes somebody English, and what makes somebody non-English?
Yeah, I think
somebody who's born in Birmingham. Somebody
who's white, who's had both white parents who are English, monolingual English speakers. They are English.
The reason why I actually raised this in Identity Crisis is I actually recently attended a seminar which actually covered this particular area, which was unexplained. And it is the reason why, when you say English, it is purely referred to our brothers and sisters from the white majority group, purely because England was first England, and only people who were living in England were Caucasians, and this is what. But anyway, that takes us away from what we're talking about in terms of identity crisis, and let's not even go down that route. Identity crisis in the two particular areas of Asians living in two different areas result of how they see society operating around them, and on the other hand, how their family household environment is. Well, I must thank you, both of you, for your valuable time. You added value to the show in a tremendous way. We used your expertise, and once again, I would remind our viewers that this show is for you. You're more than welcome to come and question our panelists, and if you think that you want to ask a question, you have something that you wish to add to the format of the show, please write to us. There is an email address that you can see on the screens. It's voy@hidayat.tv, and the idea of Voice of Youth is purely to highlight the issues that we are facing in the Western world today, and how we can actually highlight those issues and hopefully resolve those issues, so that we could make ourselves a better nation, a better society, and hopefully serve the community better. The message to all the members of youth is that you have to work together for a better future, and people who are actually working in respectable positions, you need to look back at your community and add value. On that note, we shall see you next weekend on Saturday and Sunday. Here your host Ali Mohsin Hashmi and my guest Sayyida Quratul Anzadi and Sayyida Amina Bukhari. Once again, I thank you on behalf of our audience and on behalf of Hidayat Television Network for sparing your moments with us today and yesterday. We shall see you next week. On that note, look after yourself and your surroundings and add value to the community. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.